What's up, gangsters? It is a sunny but cold day out here in the middle of nowhere at Rube Goldberg Enterprises. And while my last couple of videos have been my favorite kind because they've featured finished projects, this video is my least favorite kind. Because this is a how-to video where I will attempt to demonstrate how to on camera. And I just hate that. I feel like I'm no good at doing it. I feel like, working live on camera is painfully slow, which I know might make you guys laugh given how long my videos are most of the time anyway. But it just feels painfully slow to me. They always end up taking a long time. And I'm not always happy with the results of what I'm doing while I'm demonstrating. And especially with what I'm going to try and demonstrate today, it's always for me a process of kind of discovery and adapting as I go and figuring it out along the way before I get to the result that I really like. And that doesn't always lend itself to a concise explanation of how it's done. So anyway, you're like, what the hell? What are you gonna show us? So this is going to be about oil paint rendering, and the only reason that I'm doing it is because I've had a number of people ask me to, and I just kind of feel like, well, I ought to give it a whirl. I don't consider myself the authority on oil paint rendering. That would be Mike Rinaldi. If you really want to get the nitty-gritty on the hows and whys of it, then I would strongly encourage you to buy some of his books because he gives a pretty good explanation. There are also some videos on YouTube where he demonstrates. But one thing that he doesn't do a lot of is get like right in tight and close. And that, quite frankly, is sort of my beef with a lot of how-to painting videos on YouTube. I was watching one, or tried to watch one the other day, about how to paint faces on 1/35th scale figures, and the entire 30 minutes of demonstration was a camera view of a figure, of a 1/35th scale figure that literally would have been about that big, maybe, in the entire frame. I mean, the explanations were great, but you just couldn't see any of what was going on. And for me, I don't know. I feel like if you're going to really demonstrate something like that, it's got to be right in there close, because especially with oil paint rendering, so much of it gets down to the tools and the technique, and that happens, at a little tiny scale, and you've got to be able to see it for it to be effective. So anyway, I just did the final stages of weathering and finished up my Thunder Models 1/35th scale case VAI tractor project last week. And as I was doing that, I thought, well, maybe I should try and do a how-to on the oil paint weathering that I'm doing on this thing. Actually, it was more like maybe I should try again, because I actually tried to do this same video last year while I was finishing up my Special Hobby Tempest, and I just didn't like the way it came out. So anyway, maybe this one will be better. I will leave it up to you guys to judge, and you can let me know in the comments. So here we go. Let's do some oil paint rendering. Alright, so first let's talk a little bit about the paints themselves. As you can see, I've got a range of oils here that I've collected, and they each kind of have different characteristics that are worth talking about. I think everybody's familiar with Winsor & Newton, and you know that they offer several different grades of oils. And my understanding about what differentiates the grades of oils is that it really comes down to pigment. Pigment is the most expensive thing in any of these paints. And so Winton, which is the student grade oil from Winsor & Newton, has a lower pigment content, has some fillers in there, and has, I guess, It's basically just a different percentage of the oils, and so that allows them to be less expensive. But it also means that they may not blend as smoothly, and you may see that the colors will break up a little bit more when you mix them up as washes. I've definitely seen that myself when compared with the regular Winsor & Newton Artist's oil colors. Now, that may be fine. For the stuff we do, it may not really even be a noticeable difference. I kind of do, and I don't think I'll buy any more of the Winton once these are gone, but especially for colors like red and yellow that I use rarely, I think that they are probably okay. Now, the Winsor & Newton Artist Oil color is kind of the standard, and I feel like it represents really sort of the best compromise between quality and price. These aren't cheap. You might pay 10 or 11 bucks for a tube of this stuff. But on the scale of what oils can cost, I mean, I've seen stuff where handmade oils that are really high in pigment can cost several $100s for a tube. So these are really not that expensive on the overall scale, and you have to remember that they're going to last you a long time. So the value really is still pretty good, even if you pay twice as much for this one as you do for this one. Now, you'll see that there's a third Winsor & Newton variety here, which is this Griffin Alkyd. And you can see that it says right here that it's a fast-drying oil color. And that has proven to be true. I like them. I mean, I feel like the smoothness of the blending and the pigment quality and all of those sort of qualitative assessments compared to these others are pretty good, but they do definitely dry faster. Sometimes a little too fast when it comes to blending. For blending, what you want is a real smooth, creamy kind of a texture. And the traditional artist oil color are definitely better in that respect. What's also really good in terms of smoothness is this Abteilung 502 stuff from, I was about to say from MIG, but I'm not sure that there's any connection. At any rate, these are really nice. They are very smooth, they blend really well, and they dry surprisingly fast. I noticed that almost immediately when I started using them. I haven't used them nearly as much as I have this other stuff, but I definitely do like them, and I would recommend them. They offer a lot of ready mixed shades that are very useful for the stuff that we do. Okay, so the next thing is, now that we've kind of covered the paints themselves, is to go over the colors that I'm going to use for this little tractor project. What I have here, and I should note that I've got these laid out on cardboard. This is something that Mike Rinaldi recommends, and I think it's a good trick. What you'll notice is that the oil is leaching out of the materials, and you can see kind of to varying degrees. This one has a lot extra here because it was right at the top of the tube and is relatively new, and so it had a little bubble of oil sitting right there under the cap. But this is pretty normal after these have sat here for, I think they've been sitting here for about an hour. Rinaldi recommends a minimum of a half an hour, which I think is good. And for weathering purposes, it's the right thing to do because they will dry faster with the oil leached out of them, and they will dry more flat. If you're doing figure painting, or you actually want to use these for blending, for wet blending, then what you actually want is for them to stay wetter and kind of creamier. And so for like my figure stuff, I don't put the oils on cardboard. I just put them in one of these little aluminum things and use them that way, but different purposes. So the colors themselves that I've got out here. Now, this tractor is basically all red, as you can see from this picture. This is one of my reference photos. And so, what I have here are colors that are going to help me emphasize the reds, and then various colors that will help me create dirt and oil and fading and different things like that. Now, this is a point to talk about what some people call oil dot filtering, which I am not a fan of. And basically, the way that works is you put little dots of all of your colors, red, blue, green, yellow, purple, whatever, all over your model. And then with a brush that's slightly dampened with mineral spirits, you just start blending it. And I really feel like that's kind of a brute force technique and isn't really that effective. Basically, it's just another way of doing a filter. And in my opinion, it ends up looking kind of muddy and sometimes kind of weird when you've got, for example, an olive drab color with a little bit of a blue tint to it. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't do oil dot filtering or whatever you want to call it. I pick colors that, like I said, are going to help me emphasize the tones that are already there. So since this tractor is kind of an orange-red, I've got those two hues right here in the middle, and then all of these others around. Now, let me talk about the white for a second. This white is Winsor Newton titanium white. And a lot of people are going to wonder why I'm not using Winsor Newton transparent white, because it's kind of a favorite for fading. I'm a little bit over transparent white. I think it works well in some cases, but I've noticed that particularly on top of blacks, that it tends to have a bluish tint to it. And I'm not really sure why that's true, but it's definitely noticeable to me, and I don't like it. So I've gone back to the transparent or the titanium white because it doesn't do that. It stays neutral. So what I have here is raw sienna, burnt sienna, raw umber, burnt umber, and those are all going to help with things like rust and oil and grease and stuff like that. Then I've got over here, I've got the 502 Shadow Brown, and then I think this one's called Cream Brown. Again, the Shadow Brown is just good for, oil and grime and stuff. This Cream Brown I'm going to use on the exhaust manifold, and then I've got just the black. This is the Winsor Newton Ivory Black and White. Okay, so that's all of the paints. Now let's talk about thinners, even though I will not be using thinners a whole lot for this. And I'll explain that as I go. I've got standard mineral spirits. This is just cheap hardware store stuff, which I use for cleaning my brushes, and honestly I use it sometimes for blending too. And then I've got this more expensive and better Winsor & Newton Sans Odor, which is a odorless mineral spirits. And basically what they do to get from this cheap stuff to this stuff is this is just more refined and distilled to remove the sulfur components that give the stink to diesel and kerosene and regular old mineral spirits. And so it's a little bit more expensive, but it's nice because it doesn't stink if that bothers you. I do find this also blends a little bit smoother. It does behave just a little bit differently. It's kind of hard to articulate how and why I would choose one over the other, but there are some sort of behavioral differences. Now, Mike Rinaldi is a big fan of turpentine. I am not. I tried using it after I saw that it was his favorite thing, and I quickly discovered that it is quite a bit harsher than regular mineral spirits, and that it can affect whatever your clear coat is or whatever you're working on top of with your oils. And I generally am working on top of like Tester's Dull Coat, which is their flat clear lacquer, or MRP's Super Clear Matte, and it's also a lacquer. And I've found that turpentine, even in the small amounts required for some of this blending work, will sometimes strip right through it. So you definitely don't want that. Regular mineral spirits will do it too, but you have to work a little harder to make it happen. So, the key with all this stuff is to use a light touch and only as much of the solvent as is really required, which really should just be very little. And you'll see I use almost none of it. So I think that pretty much covers the materials. Now let's talk about brushes. Something that I do definitely agree with Mike Rinaldi on is these right here. These are Lowe and Cornell number 2 Ultra Rounds, and they're really good. You can see they've got a very long, skinny point on them, and they work really, really well for precision placement of your paints. And you can even use them for blending some as well. What I also use, are my favorites are, let's see, I should have gotten these out before I got started here. For blending, I feel like you really need some filberts and maybe even some rounds. This is I think a 1/8 inch filbert. It's a little fluffy these days, so it's a little bit more like a round, but you can see that the ferrule is flattened there. Let's see, I've got a couple of other filberts. This is a filbert. It's a little bit bigger. I like this one a lot. It's soft. Doesn't have a tremendous amount of snap to it, so it blends smoothly. Let's see, I've got yet another one over here that I use. This is a different brand of filbert. It's a little flatter and a little bit stiffer, but you can see what that's like. And a lot of these brushes you can find on Amazon or go to Dick Blick Art Supplies, whatever. They're relatively easy to find and relatively inexpensive. I think these Lowe and Cornell number 2s are, I don't know if I remember right or not, I think they're like $7 or something. So not too bad. I bought like 5 of them at once. Now, something else that I like on larger surfaces that I'll use sometimes for blending is this gigantic filbert. I mean, it's soft and big, and it really does a nice job of blending. But I won't be using it on this particular little thing. Another one that's really powerful for doing things like streaking on aircraft, because you got to keep in mind, these techniques are not just for armor or tractors or whatever. I mean, they work good on airplanes as well. So for things like streaking, what I like to do is I use this, which is called a wisp. And I've got several different sizes of this. This is made by Royal Aquilon Wisp. And these are really nice because what you can do is put down a few little dabs of your oil and then just very lightly drag this through it. And it does a really nice job of creating a streak on the bottom of a fuselage or a wing or whatever the case may be. So, all right then, that pretty much covers the materials and the tools. Let's get busy with some actual work. All right, now, what I'd like to do as much as possible is work off of reference photos, and I already showed you this one. So this will give you an idea of some of what I'm trying to recreate here. I'm going to be concentrating on the area around the engine and the transmission and so forth here. And you can see that there's some really nice discolorations there underneath the carburetor and around the back end of the engine cases there. I've got another one here. Let's see, this one is a little bit more of a derelict, but you can see it has also some kind of common tones. You can see there's a lot of variation in the red and the orange in here. And then there's kind of a nice sort of a drip of fuel, I suppose. The gas tank is right underneath here. So right here you've got a nice drip of fuel, and then you can see some more stains over here on the engine block. So what I'm going to be trying to do as much as possible is to use these pictures to create as much of the same thing as possible. I kind of just use it as a creative guide to help me decide where to put colors and what to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with the fuel stain, or whatever that is, that's right underneath the gas tank here. So I'm going to try and get this oriented in a way that's a little bit easier to work with and see on camera. That may be too tall of an order, I don't know, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so this is a good time to make a couple of points. As you can see, what I've been doing here is applying the oil where I want from a brush that is dry. Let me zoom back out here so this is a little easier to show. I apply the oil with a brush that's dry. This has not had any thinners on it whatsoever. And I keep that brush separate. This is one of the things that's challenging, at least for me, with working with these oils, is keeping my brushes separate. Because sometimes you want a brush that's dry, sometimes you want one that's got a lot of thinner in it, and sometimes you want one that's got thinner and paint. This brush, as I tried to demonstrate there, is just dipped in the odorless mineral spirits. And I used that to do a little bit of wet blending. But you don't necessarily have to do that. I kind of didn't like the way that it went on this side. I don't know if you were able to see it in camera, but it creates a different sort of a look. It's a little bit more blotchy. It just doesn't behave the same way. It's okay. It still looks pretty natural. But I just chose not to do that for the other side. You may also have noticed there that what I did was dry it a little bit with the air from my airbrush so that I could get a better look at how it was going to turn out before I moved on. On this side, I used my little tiny filbert to blend it dry, and then I came back with a third brush that I had dipped in thinner and then dipped into my palette over here just to create a little bit of a wash on the fly. And this is one of the things that to me is the most fun and the most powerful about oils, is that when you've got your palette and you've got your bottle of thinner right there, you have complete control over the viscosity of your paint. You can go from totally pure paint paste to a super thin wash in the blink of an eye, basically just by using using your brush to blend in a little bit of thinner and create a little bit of a pot of a wash right there on your palette. And you can see that I applied that there around this feature here to create the effect of, you know, fuel and grime that's kind of worked its way around that and around these bolts. So, but the important thing is that once you dip a brush in your thinner, it's important to keep it separate so that you don't accidentally then start using it for something else, because you'll find out pretty quickly you may get an effect that you weren't planning for. Now, that's not really a big deal, because again, one of the great things about working with oils is that you can pretty much instantly correct it by either wiping it completely off with a brush that's been dipped in mineral spirits, or using a Q-tip or something like that. So you really don't have to be scared, because it's just almost impossible to screw it up permanently. Now I'm going to move on and do some of the work on the side of the engine block right here. Okay, now time for another step. What you've seen me doing here is basically just the standard process of applying the oils where I want them with little dots. Sometimes I actually try to just sort of draw in the shape that I'm after. Sometimes I'm trying to just be random, just kind of depends. But then when I do the blending, you can see that I still have just kind of this weird streaky looking effect. It doesn't really look like anything special. So what I do then as my third step is I come along here with this, a piece of sponge that I will dip in the mineral spirits, and I'm going with the odorless, and then I'll get rid of most of the mineral spirits by dabbing it on a paper towel, and then I'll start working that to create a dappled, kind of a speckled look to it. And this is, again, kind of why sometimes I prefer regular mineral spirits over the odorless stuff, because it's just not working as well as I want it to. With the sponge, so I'm going to use the brush to work that a little bit more. And this is one of the things about working on flat paint versus a glossy surface. If I were working on a glossy surface, these would move around a lot more. But flat paint tends to give it more traction, which can be either a benefit, or as you can see, it can make it sometimes where they're not as cooperative and they just don't want to move as easily. So we'll try some of the regular old bog standard hardware store mineral spirits and see how that does. And you can see that they're just not really shifting that much, which is annoying, but it's okay because, again, oils give you a lot of freedom to sort of try and fail. And like I said, it's pretty tough to screw it up because you can always come back and blend over it or remove it completely. See there, it just took a little bit stiffer brush and a little bit more pressure. This thing is pretty easy to move, so it's tough to get a lot of pressure on there, but that's kind of what it took to get it to behave a little bit better. And this is kind of the way that it goes with oils, where sometimes it's kind of just a matter of working and discovering as you go and just being kind of flexible and adapting as you work to doing what you have to do to get the look that you're after. And so that's part of why I like to use reference photos, so that I've got something to kind of guide me as I'm working and give me some idea if I'm getting where I want to be. Like this is a good example. I got a nice tonal variation with the cream brown on the exhaust right here on the right hand side of the manifold, but not as much over here on the left. So fine, just come back with a little bit more and use my same brush that I was using for the other thing with some of the regular mineral spirits in it, and just kind of dapple that to create those tones. And we'll let that dry and then have a little bit better look at it and see what we think. I'm going to get my brush that's got both mineral spirits and paint, and I'm going to get back into my orange that I've blended up and come back over here and do a little bit more of that. And I'll clean that out. There we go. That gave me some nice small tonal variety there. And that's the thing that you're after, is number one, to not allow anything to look like paint that was stuck there with a brush. So you don't want brush strokes, obviously. You don't want obvious little blobs of material. And then the second thing is to keep things random. This is just like chipping, where randomness and distribution and location and all of those things really make a difference in how authentic the final effect is. And a big part of that is also getting it small enough. So little tiny variations in your colors and controlled sort of shapes are what define that. When I look at my picture, this thing has a kind of a particular shape to this stain that's right here. And so I'm going to attempt to sort of draw that in. And then I'll come back with even more mineral spirits because I want that to be a very sort of thin, kind of a translucent black. So I want it to be almost like a wash right there. What I find is that oils are really sensitive to tools and techniques. So sometimes you just have to kind of mess around with it until you find the right brush and the right stroke to get exactly what you want. So see there how quickly I dried that off to see what I've got, and it's not quite what I want. I want it to be a little more translucent and a little more blended. So I'm coming back with a brush that's dry, completely dry, and just working that. A little bit more. Still didn't get it quite as translucent as I want, so I'm going to use this stiffer brush that has just a tad of mineral spirits still in it. Okay, so there you go. As predicted, pretty long, pretty drawn out, and that's even with the video clips sped up. But that's just the way it is. I mean, partly because of my own clumsiness, partly because of my own, just lack of skill, and as I said, because I sort of work this stuff out as I go, that actually took me probably 2 or 3 hours to actually do all that work. And obviously, I was not going to subject you guys to that nonsense in real time. So anyway, I hope you like it. I hope it works. I hope it answers some of your questions about at least how I do my oil paint rendering. Like I said up front, I don't feel like I'm an expert at it. It's a discovery process for me every time I sit down to do it. About the only thing I can tell you is the same every time is the materials and the tools that I'm going to use. But the way that the specific colors work out, and the actual finished effect, that's just, something that happens as it does. And I kind of feel like I just know when I'm done because it just sort of clicks for me and I can say, okay, I like this and I can move on. So anyway, like I said, I hope that's helpful, and if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to hit me up in the comments or over on Scale Modeler's Critique Group. And as always, if you've suffered through this, I definitely appreciate it. Much love.